The words hit Eudora Graves like a bullet she had not seen coming, tearing through every wall she had carefully constructed around her heart in the past 3 years of wandering. I have sat here for years and never once wanted company until now. Isaac Yates said it without looking at her. His dark eyes were fixed on the slow brown roll of the Cimarron River, his broad shoulders set against the dying light of a New Mexico evening in the autumn of 1881. The confession came out of him the way blood comes out of a wound, reluctant and unstoppable at once, and Eudora felt the full weight of it settle over her like a second skin. She did not speak. She was afraid that if she opened her mouth, something irrevocable would come out of it, something she had been carrying since the moment she had arrived in the town of Perdition Creek 6 weeks ago with nothing but a carpet bag, a dead man's name sewn into the lining of her coat, and a secret that could get her killed before sunrise. The river moved. A coyote called somewhere beyond the cottonwood trees. Isaac Yates, the most feared gunslinger between Santa Fe and Dodge City, the man they called the Cimarron Ghost, the man with a reputation built on silence and precision, and a coldness that other men spoke about the way they spoke about bad weather, sat with his elbows on his knees and his hat pushed back and looked absolutely undone. And Eudora, who had ridden into Perdition Creek under a false name with a hidden motive that could destroy them both, felt the trap she had set for herself close around her heart like iron jaws. Because she had not planned to feel anything for him. She had planned to use him. She had planned to get close enough to learn what he knew about the night her brother was murdered, and then she had planned to ride away before anyone, including Isaac Yates himself, could figure out who she really was. She was not supposed to be sitting beside him at the river in the blue hour, listening to the most guarded man in the New Mexico territory confess something that no amount of whiskey or danger had ever pulled out of him before. She was not supposed to feel her chest crack open like dry earth in a rainstorm, but here they were. And to understand how two people arrived at a moment so tender and so terrifying, you had to go back to the beginning of it. Back to the October morning 6 weeks before when the stagecoach from Trinidad rolled into Perdition Creek, trailing a curtain of red dust, and a woman with river-dark hair and calculating brown eyes stepped down into the street with her carpetbag in one hand, and her whole hidden life pressed flat against her ribs. Perdition Creek in October of 1881 was the kind of town that existed in the spaces between more important places. It sat in a shallow valley in the northeastern corner of New Mexico territory, close enough to the Cimarron River that the air always tasted faintly of iron and clay. There was a main street with a saloon called the Copper Spur, a general store run by a round man named Harlan Fitch, a livery stable, a small adobe church that had not seen a priest in 8 months, and a scattering of houses built from whatever material the settlers could get their hands on. There was also a sheriff named Walt Prout who wore his badge slightly crooked and had the careful, watchful eyes of a man who knew more than he was supposed to about a great many things. Eudora had known about Prout before she arrived. She had done her research with the meticulous thoroughness of someone whose survival depended on preparation. She had spent 2 months in Trinidad going through newspaper clippings, speaking carefully to drifters who had passed through Perdition Creek, and piecing together the shape of what had happened to her brother Daniel Graves 14 months ago. Daniel had been 24 years old. He had gone west from their home in Missouri looking for work, for land, for something that felt like a future. He had written her letters that came every few weeks at first, and then the letters had slowed, and then there had been one final letter that arrived 6 days after the telegram telling her he was dead. The telegram said it was a robbery gone wrong. The letter, which Daniel had written 3 days before he died, said something very different. He had written, "I have found something here that frightens me, Eudora. I have seen things involving the sheriff and a man named Yates that I cannot put down on paper, except to say that if anything happens to me before I can get out, you must not come here alone. You must tell someone who can be trusted." I believe they are running something through this valley that is worth a great deal of blood to a great many men." The letter had ended there. No signature. As if Daniel had heard something in the night and had to stop writing. Eudora had sat with that letter for 2 months. She had tried going to the law in Trinidad, but the territorial authorities had looked at her with the particular exhaustion that men reserved for grieving women, and told her that a Mexican laborer had been arrested for the robbery and that the case was closed. She had tried writing to a newspaper, but without evidence. The editor had been polite and unmoved. She had stood at the edge of doing nothing and had felt herself becoming something colder and more purposeful, and she had decided that if the law would not do this, then she would do it herself. She was 26 years old. She had grown up on a Missouri farm. She could ride, she could shoot a rifle with some competence, and she had her dead father's stubbornness in her like bedrock. She did not have a plan that was anything close to safe, but she had a name, Isaac Yates, and she had the reckless certainty of someone who had run out of alternatives. What she had not known, and what no drifter's second-hand account had adequately prepared her for, was the reality of Isaac Yates himself. She had expected a brute. She had expected the kind of man that a murderous reputation made sense attached to, someone loud and brutal and easily read. She had not expected the tall, spare, quiet man she first saw standing outside the copper spur on her first morning in Perdition Creek, leaning against the wall in the way that very still people lean, not for support, but because they have nowhere they need to be and no urgency about anything, and watching the street with eyes that were dark brown and precise, and entirely unimpressed by the world they observed. She had not expected the way those eyes moved to her when she came out of the general store and then moved away again, neither drawn nor dismissive, simply registering her existence with the same calm thoroughness they gave to everything else. She had not expected him to tip his hat. It was such a small gesture. One finger to the brim of a black hat, a brief acknowledgement, nothing more. But it had surprised her enough that she had nearly walked into the hitching post in front of her, and she had felt heat rise in her face that had absolutely nothing to do with the plan. She had taken a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Clara Enfield, who had powdery white hair and the kind of cheerful nosiness that Eudora found both irritating and useful. Within 2 days of arriving, through Clara's cheerful commentary on every soul in Perdition Creek, Eudora had learned more about the social architecture of the town than she could have learned by direct questioning in a week. Isaac Yates, Clara had informed her over breakfast on the second morning, was not the villain she might expect. He had come to Perdition Creek approximately 5 years ago under circumstances nobody seemed entirely clear on, had established himself as a man not to be trifled with in the first month of his arrival, through an incident involving a pair of brothers named Kellerman, who had ridden into town looking to make trouble, and had ridden out again on their horses horizontally. Since then he had been what Clara called a necessary feature of the landscape, present, reliable in the limited sense that people knew what he was and what he was capable of, and deeply, stubbornly alone. He did not drink more than 1 glass of whiskey in an evening. He did not gamble. He did occasional work for ranchers who needed someone to convince cattle thieves to reconsider their life choices, but he turned down anything that crossed what appeared to be a personal moral line, though what exactly that line was had been the subject of considerable speculation among the residents of Perdition Creek. He sat by the river some evenings, Clara said, with a hint of romanticism that made Eudora suspect the widow harbored a fondness for him. Nobody went with him. Nobody was invited. "He is not a bad man," Clara had said, buttering her bread with the thoughtful gravity of someone delivering a verdict. "He is just a man who has been through something that has not finished finishing him." Eudora had filed all of this away behind the smooth surface of her polite, interested expression, and she had thought about what it meant in the context of Daniel's letter. She had thought about the word involving. Daniel had written involving the sheriff and a man named Yates, not directed by, not conducted by, involving. She had turned the distinction over in her mind for days. She first spoke to Isaac Yates directly on her 4th day in Perdition Creek, and it happened not through any clever maneuvering on her part, but through the town's own organic tendency to bring its small population into contact with itself. She had been at the general store buying lamp oil when Sheriff Pruitt had come in, and engaged Harlan Fitch in a loud, jovial conversation about a cattle drive that was coming through the valley in 2 weeks. The sheriff was a big man with sandy hair going gray, and an enthusiasm that struck Eudora, after Daniel's letter, as the enthusiasm of a man who spent considerable energy performing normalcy. He had noticed her in the way that men in positions of authority noticed newcomers, and he had smiled and introduced himself, and asked what had brought her to Perdition Creek. She had told him she was a widow, which was the cover story she had prepared with some care. Her name, she said, was Eudora Calloway. She had come from Kansas looking for a quieter life after losing her husband to a fever the previous winter. It was a story plain enough to be believable and sad enough to discourage further inquiry. Pruitt had expressed sympathy with the practiced ease of a man who had expressed it many times before and moved on. What she had not expected was for Isaac Yates to come into the general store approximately 10 minutes later, clearly there for nothing more than ammunition and a new pair of leather gloves, and to stop when Pruitt greeted him with an easiness that immediately recalibrated everything Eudora had assumed about their relationship. They were not friends, exactly. The way two men who have a complicated mutual understanding of each other and have arrived at a functional truce can appear friendly without warmth. Pruitt slapped Yates on the shoulder. Yates endured it with the tolerant expression of a man who has made his peace with the hand he is dealt. Then Pruitt had said, "Yates, this is Mrs. Calloway, just arrived. Lost her husband last winter. She might appreciate knowing some of our better citizens rather than the rougher variety we occasionally attract." And Isaac Yates had turned those dark, precise eyes on her, and Eudora had felt the full weight of looking at a man who was not fooled by surfaces, a man who had survived long enough in a hard life to develop an instinct for what was underneath what people showed him. And she had understood in that moment that the most dangerous thing about Isaac Yates was not his reputation with a gun. It was the way he looked at you like he already knew the parts of you that you were keeping quiet. "Mrs. Calloway," he had said. His voice was low and measured, not unkind, but economical in the way that men who don't waste words are economical. "Mr. Yates," she had said, and she had kept her chin up and her eyes steady, and she had willed herself to be nothing but a widow from Kansas. He had bought his ammunition and his gloves, and he had left. Pruitt had watched him go with an expression that Eudora catalogued carefully. Not warmth, something more calculated. The expression of a man who has a use for another person and is checking on the continued availability of that use. She had gone back to Clara's boarding house, and she had sat on the edge of her bed, and she had unfolded Daniel's letter for what felt like the 1000th time, and she had read involving the sheriff and a man named Yates, and she had begun to understand that the geography of guilt here was not what she had assumed, because there had been something in Isaac Yates' eyes when they landed on the sheriff that was not the relaxed recognition of a Confederate. It was something much more guarded. Something that looked, if she were being honest with herself, like a man who had made a compromise he had never made peace with. She started watching more carefully. She spent 2 weeks doing it. She found reasons to be in places where she could observe without being observed. She was good at this, at making herself quiet and unremarkable, a skill she had developed not from any training in deception, but from years of being the only girl in a house full of men who did not think women were worth including in serious conversations, and learning to gather information from the edges of rooms. She watched Pruitt, and she watched Yates, and she watched the men who came and went through Perdition Creek with the particular purposefulness of people passing through rather than visiting, men with good horses and hard eyes who would stop at the copper spur and speak to Pruitt in low voices and leave again before morning. And slowly, the shape of it began to emerge. Walt Prout was running stolen cattle through Perdition Creek, not just occasionally and not in small numbers. He had an operation involving several ranches further east, a route through the valley that connected to buyers in Colorado, and the kind of organization that required someone trustworthy enough to enforce silence and dangerous enough to make the alternative to silence very clear. He had, at some point in the past few years, made some kind of arrangement with Isaac Yates that gave him access to that danger. But what exactly Yates knew, and what exactly Yates had consented to, and what exactly had happened to Daniel Graves in the middle of this arrangement, she could not yet determine from observation alone. She needed to get closer to Yates. She decided the most natural way to achieve this was through the most natural mechanism available to her, which was to simply be present and consistent and let the geography of a small town do its work. She made sure to cross paths with him at reasonable intervals. She said good morning when they passed on the street. She asked him once, in the general store, whether he thought the weather would hold for the week, because she was considering whether to ride out toward the eastern hills and she did not know the country. He had looked at her for a moment with those evaluating eyes, and then said that the weather would hold but that she ought not ride east alone, that there were men moving cattle through the valley who did not appreciate witnesses. The warning had been so pointed and so carefully delivered that she had felt a cold shock of recognition. He was either warning her genuinely or testing her. She had thanked him and said she would keep to the near pastures, and she had watched his face for something, a tell, a calculation, anything, and had found only that same quiet watchfulness. By the end of the second week, she was beginning to understand that her plan, such as it was, had a fundamental flaw. She was not going to extract information from Isaac Yates through cleverness or manipulation. He was too careful for cleverness, and he was not the kind of man who could be manipulated by conventional means. The only way she was going to learn anything from him was if he decided, on his own terms and in his own time, that she was worth telling. And that was a different problem entirely, because it was not a strategic problem. It was a human problem. It required her to stop maneuvering and start being real, and being real was exactly what she had sworn she would not do in Perdition Creek, because being real meant being Eudora Graves, the dead man's sister, the woman with a hidden motive and a dangerous secret, the woman who could not afford for anyone to look at her too closely. The thing that changed the calculus was not something she planned. On a Thursday morning in the third week of October, Eudora was crossing the street from Clara's boarding house to the general store when she heard raised voices from the alley beside the copper spur. She should have kept walking. Every instinct she had acquired since arriving in Perdition Creek told her to keep walking, to be the unremarkable widow from Kansas who did not involve herself in trouble. But one of the voices was a woman's. She stopped. She turned. She walked down the side of the copper spur toward the alley entrance, and she found a girl of perhaps 19 being pressed against the wall by a man Eudora recognized as one of Prout's occasional visitors, a heavy-set man with a reddish beard named Colton, who had the entitled physicality of someone who had never once been held accountable for anything he wanted. He had the girl's wrist in his hand, and he was saying something to her in a low, ugly voice. Eudora did not think. She said, loudly and clearly, "Take your hand off her." Colton turned. He looked at her with the contemptuous patience of a man evaluating an inconvenience. He said something dismissive that Eudora did not quite catch because the blood was loud in her ears, and he tightened his grip on the girl's wrist. Eudora reached into her carpetbag and took out the small-caliber pistol she had been carrying for exactly the kind of situation she had been promising herself she would never get into, and she pointed it at Colton's midsection with both hands to keep them steady, and she said again, "Take your hand off her." The alley went very still. And then a third voice said, from behind and to her left, "I would listen to the lady, Colton. She looks like she means it." Isaac Yates stepped out of the morning shadow at the alley entrance with his right hand loose at his side, and his hat pulled low, and his voice carrying that same measured quality it always had, except that underneath the measured quality was something like iron, and Colton read it with the animal accuracy of a man who had survived by knowing which fights to take. He let go of the girl. He looked at Yates with a calculation that lasted approximately 2 seconds, and then he looked at Eudora with something that was not quite defeat but was its neighbor, and he walked away down the alley without another word. The girl, whose name turned out to be Rosa Medina, and who worked in the kitchen of the Copper Spur, took a shaking breath and said something in a mix of Spanish and English that amounted to a profound thank you, and Eudora lowered the pistol and felt her hands begin to tremble with the delayed arrival of her own terror. She was putting the pistol back into her carpetbag when she became aware that Isaac Yates was still standing there and was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not exactly warm, but it was something other than the polite, non-committal register he had used with her on every previous occasion. It was something more considered, more present. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said. "I have been told those are often the same thing," she said. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. It was there, and gone so fast she might have imagined it, but she did not think she had imagined it. "Where did you learn to hold a pistol like that?" he asked. "My father," she said. "He believed women ought to be able to defend themselves. Smart man. He was." There was a pause. Yates looked at her in that way he had of looking at people, as if he were reading something written in very small text just beneath the surface of what they were showing him. Then he said, "Colton rides for a man who does not take interference lightly." "Then I will be careful," she said. "Mrs. Calloway." He said her assumed name in a way that was neither endorsing nor questioning it, just placing it in the air between them. "How long are you planning to stay in Perdition Creek?" "I have not decided," she said. "That answer will not serve you here much longer," he said. "This is a town where not having decided becomes its own kind of decision." He left her with that, touching his hat again in that brief way he had, and walked back toward the main street, and Eudora stood in the October morning watching him go and feeling the first genuine thread of doubt about whether she could do what she had come here to do. Because the man walking away was not the man Daniel's letter had implied. He was not, she was increasingly certain, the architect of her brother's death. He was something more complicated and more painful than a villain, and complicated, painful things were so much harder to navigate than simple, evil ones. She found out about the river the following evening through Clara, who mentioned that Yates spent most evenings down at the Cottonwood Bend of the Cimarron, about a half-mile from town, and that nobody ever went near him there. It was considered one of those unspoken understandings that Perdition Creek had accumulated around him over 5 years, like the understanding that you did not sit in the chair nearest the door at the Copper Spur, because that was where Yates sat when he came in. Eudora told herself she was going to the river to think. She told herself she was not going to the river to be near him. She told herself a number of other things as she walked through the dry grass in the evening cool with her shawl pulled around her shoulders and the last light going amber over the cottonwood leaves. He was there. He was sitting on a flat rock at the water's edge, his hat beside him, his elbows on his knees, looking at the river with the absolute stillness of someone who has been sitting in one place for a very long time without any intention of moving. He did not look up when she came to the bank some 20 feet from him, and for a moment she thought she would simply turn around and walk back, honor the unspoken rule, give him the solitude that the whole town apparently understood was his. But she did not turn around. She sat down on the bank, not near him, not intrusively near, but in the same general territory of the riverbank, and she pulled her shawl tighter and looked at the river and said nothing. He said nothing for a very long time. The Cimarron moved in that slow brown way it had in October, carrying the smell of clay and cold distance, and the cottonwood leaves turned in the last of the light and the first stars appeared in the eastern sky, and Eudora sat with all of her secrets and her grief and her hidden motive pressing against the inside of her chest, and she thought about her brother, and she let herself, very briefly, be nothing but a woman sitting by a river. He finally said, "People do not generally come here." "I know," she said. "Clara told me." Another silence. Then he said, "Yet here you are." "Yet here I am," she agreed. Something settled in the air between them. Not comfort exactly, not yet, but an absence of the tension she had expected. A strange neutrality that felt less like two strangers sitting awkwardly near each other and more like two people who had been tired for a very long time and had independently arrived at the same quiet place. She came back the following evening. He was there again. He did not tell her not to come. He did not acknowledge her presence any more than he had the first time, but she had the distinct impression, impossible to articulate, that the set of his shoulders was slightly less closed than it had been the evening before. By the third evening they were talking. Small things at first. The weather, the river, the cottonwood trees, the fact that the coyotes had been unusually vocal for the past several nights, which apparently meant a change in the season was coming sooner than expected. Isaac Yates, she discovered, knew an extraordinary amount about the natural world and spoke about it with a quiet precision that was nothing like what she had expected from a gunslinger, and everything like what she might have expected from someone who had spent years paying close attention to the only company that never asked anything of him. By the fifth evening she was learning the edges of his past without having asked for any of it directly. She learned that he was from Texas originally, from a cattle family near Abilene, that he had left at 18 after a dispute with his father that he described in the sparse, declarative terms that men use when they are summarizing pain. They do not want to revisit. She learned that he had been a deputy in 2 different towns before the events that had given him his current reputation, events he did not describe except to say that they had been necessary, and that necessity was not the same as something to be proud of. She did not tell him the truth about herself. She kept Eudora Calloway in place like a mask she wore so consistently that some mornings she almost believed in her herself. But she was listening, always listening, and she was filing every piece of information away against the map she was building of what had happened to Daniel. And she was, against every plan and every firm instruction she had given herself, beginning to care about what happened to Isaac Yates. It had happened so gradually that she could not have identified the exact moment of it. It was cumulative. It was the way he spoke about the natural world. It was the way he had stepped into that alley without hesitation, when she had done something reckless that she should not have done alone. It was the way he occasionally went so long without speaking that the silence became a kind of presence of its own, a comfortable presence, the presence of someone who was not demanding anything. It was the way he watched the river as if it were telling him something he needed to hear. She was in serious trouble, and she knew it, and she kept going to the river anyway. On the 7th evening he told her something that rearranged her entire understanding of the situation. He told her, not with any particular drama and not as if he were making a confession, but in the same quiet way he discussed everything, that approximately 14 months ago he had discovered something about Walt Prout that had put him in the position of knowing a crime was happening and being unable to stop it through legitimate means because the evidence was insufficient and the territorial law was slow, and the people involved had the resources to disappear any accusation before it could gain traction. He did not use the word cattle. He did not use the word Prout. He described the situation with a careful obliqueness that told her he was not yet ready to trust her with specifics, and that he was monitoring her reaction to the general shape of what he was saying. She kept her face very still. She asked what he had done about it. He said he had made a decision that he had found it difficult to live with, which was to stay close to the operation, without being part of it, in the hope that eventually the scale of it would make it impossible to ignore, or that the people higher up in the supply chain would make a mistake that could be documented. He said he was not proud of this. He said it was not the decision of a man who was as uncompromising as his reputation suggested. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time. The river moved. A night bird called somewhere in the cottonwoods. "Because you are not who you say you are," he said quietly. "And I have been trying to decide what to do about that for 2 weeks. And I have decided that whatever you are here for is probably closer to justice than anything else I can see, and I am tired of watching things that ought not to be watched." The confession hit her like cold water. She did not deny it. The lie had been useful, and it had served its purpose, and it had now become the most dangerous thing about her position. And she was sitting by the river in the dark with a man who had just told her he could see through her, and who had, she now realized, been deciding whether to help her instead of deciding whether to expose her. She told him her name was Eudora Graves. She told him about Daniel. She told him about the letter and the telegram, and the 2 months in Trinidad, and the decision she had made to come here alone, because there was no one else to come. She told him all of it in a flat, careful voice that she kept steady through nothing but the same willpower that had carried her this far, and she watched his face through every word of it and saw him go very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. When she finished, he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your brother's name was Daniel Graves." "Yes," she said. "He came to me," Isaac said. He was looking at the river, and his voice had gone to something lower and slower than its usual register. 3 nights before he died, he had seen something he was not supposed to see, a meeting between Prout and the Colorado buyers. "He came to me because he had heard I was somebody who might be able to help him get word to the right people without getting killed before the word arrived." Eudora's hands pressed flat against the rock beneath her. "I told him I was working on it," Isaac said. "I told him to be careful. I told him to stay quiet and stay close to people and not ride out alone. He did not listen." The last sentence was said with a grief so controlled it was barely audible, but it was there, and Eudora heard it entirely. "He rode out the next night. I do not know why. I was not there to stop it. Prout's man Colton found him on the eastern road." The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of 2 people standing inside a truth that had broken something open in both of them. "Colton," Eudora said. "Yes." She thought about Colton in the alley. She thought about herself pointing a small-caliber pistol at a man who had murdered her brother and not knowing it, standing 3 feet from the answer to everything she had come here for, and she felt a dizzying convergence of rage and grief, and something that was almost dark humor at the sheer bitter irony of it. She said, "You have been gathering evidence." "Trying to," he said. "I have a letter that Prout wrote to the Colorado buyer last spring. I took it before it was sent." Implicates Prout in the theft operation clearly. It is not enough to implicate Colton in your brother's death, but it is enough to bring the territorial marshals down on Prout in a way that will unravel everything. "Why have you not sent it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed a witness, someone who could corroborate the chain of possession when the letter was presented, someone with no stake in the cattle operation who would be believed." She understood immediately. "You need me," she said. "I need someone," he said, "and you came." This was the moment she would think later when the geography of everything shifted. Because she had come to Perdition Creek to use him as a means to an end, and he had been waiting here with the same intention in reverse, and they had circled each other for 3 weeks while the truth was always right there between them. And now it was out and they were on the same side of it, and the trap that she had believed was closing around her heart was not a trap at all. It was something else. She said, "What do we do?" He said, "We are careful, we are patient, and we do not let Prout know that we know." She nodded. He looked at her then fully, in a way he had not quite done before, and she felt the full force of it, the attention of someone who had been watching the world from a careful distance for years and had not, until now, found anything in it worth moving toward. "I am sorry about your brother," he said. She had been holding herself together with both hands for weeks, and the simplicity of those words, the directness of them, the fact that they were addressed to Eudora Graves and not to Eudora Calloway, undid something. She did not cry exactly. Her eyes went bright and her throat closed, and she pressed her lips together and she breathed through it. And Isaac Yates, who had perhaps learned by watching the world long enough what to do and what not to do, did not say anything else and did not look away. When she had steadied herself, she said, "I do not know how to thank you. You came here alone to find the truth for him," he said. "He would not need your thanks either." They sat by the river for another hour without speaking, and the night deepened around them, and the stars opened up overhead in the particular extravagance that they reserved for the high desert dark, and the Cimarron moved and moved and moved. Over the next 3 weeks, Eudora and Isaac worked together with a careful precision born of mutual necessity and growing trust. The letter was in a sealed envelope inside a loose stone in the floor of the abandoned blacksmith shop at the edge of town, and Isaac retrieved it one morning, while Eudora stood as lookout at the corner of the main street, her heart hammering and her face, arranged in the perfectly ordinary expression of a woman, deciding whether to go into the general store or the boarding house first. They composed a letter to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe together, working on it at Clara's kitchen table on a morning when Clara was at the church for one of her regular organizational meetings. The work of it was methodical and careful and took hours, because the framing needed to be precise enough to compel action and specific enough to hold up when examined, and because Isaac had strong opinions about language that Eudora found surprising, and then, upon reflection, not surprising at all from a man who had spent years watching what happened when things were said imprecisely. They sent it by the territorial mail through Trinidad with a trusted freighter named Carlos, who ran supplies between the valley and the town twice a month, and who had his own reasons for wanting Prute's operation dismantled, reasons rooted in the injustice that his cousin's family had suffered when Prute's men had driven them off their grazing land 3 years ago without compensation or consequence. While they waited for a response, they continued meeting at the river in the evenings. But these evenings were different from the carefully navigated ones of the first weeks. There was no maneuvering now. There was no strategy on Eudora's side and no watchful evaluation on Isaac's side. There was simply 2 people who had discovered in each other something that neither of them had been looking for, and that neither of them quite knew what to do with. She learned that he liked mathematics. He had taught himself from a book he had found in a burned ranch house in Texas when he was 16, and had found in the orderliness of numbers something the chaotic surface of his life had never provided. He occasionally worked out calculations in the margins of whatever paper he had at hand, and he had the habit of doing arithmetic in his head during quiet moments that she found charming in a way that surprised her each time she noticed it. He learned that she had been the person in her family who kept the accounts and the records, and that she had for several years before Daniel's death been running the practical business of the family farm with her mother, while her brothers provided the physical labor, and that she was both more capable and more accustomed to authority than she appeared. He found this not surprising but satisfying, in the way that a theory confirmed by evidence is satisfying. He also learned that she was funny. Not in a performing way, not in the way of people who use humor to manage other people's impressions of them, but in the dry, slightly sideways way of someone who sees the absurdity in things and cannot quite help noting it. He did not laugh often, but she found she could make him laugh, and the first time she heard it, she felt something shift in her chest like a door opening onto a room she had not known was there. "You are not what I expected," he told her one evening about 3 weeks into their collaboration, the 5th week of her time in Perdition Creek. "What did you expect?" she asked. He considered. "Someone more frightened." "I am frightened," she said. "I know," he said. "But it is not running you." She looked at him in the last of the light, this spare, careful man who had been sitting by this river for years in a kind of voluntary exile from everything that might ask something of him emotionally, and she thought about what it cost someone to choose that, and she thought about what it meant that he had not chosen it with her. "Isaac," she said, his given name in her mouth. She had been careful with it, careful about when she used it, as if overuse might wear away its particular weight. "Yes," he said. She said, "What was the decision? The one you said you found it difficult to live with." He was quiet for a long time. The river moved. "I knew about the first death," he said finally. "Before your brother. There was a Mexican man named Edmundo Torres who was working a small ranch east of town. He saw something. Prout moved against him, and I knew it was coming, and I did not move fast enough, and he died before I could prevent it." He paused. "I told myself that if I moved too soon, I would lose the position I needed to document everything. I told myself it was a strategic calculation. I have spent a considerable amount of time since then understanding that it was also fear." "Fear of what?" she asked. "That I would fail to make it matter," he said quietly. "That I would put myself against the whole weight of it and it would close over me and nothing would change. I have seen that happen. I have seen men do the right thing and get buried for it and the world not shift 1 inch." She sat with that. "And now I have your brother's death and Edmundo Torres' death, and the fact that you rode into this valley alone because the law would not do it, and I am done being strategic about it." He turned and looked at her, and the expression on his face was not the guarded, evaluating expression she had catalogued so carefully over the past weeks. It was open in a way that seemed, on him, almost raw. "I am done sitting here waiting for a moment that will never be clean enough." "Then we make the moment," she said. The letter from the territorial marshal's office arrived on a Wednesday morning in the first week of November, brought by a rider who stopped at the post alcove in Harlan Fitch's general store. Carlos had gotten it there faster than either of them had dared hope. Eudora found it among the mail that Clara collected and brought to the breakfast table, and she took it to Isaac that afternoon at the far end of the main street, where he was checking a horse's shoe at the livery, and they read it standing close together, with the cold November wind moving between the buildings. The marshal had received the letter and the copied evidence. He would be sending 2 deputy marshals and would arrive himself within 10 days. His instructions were that they were to maintain normal appearances and under no circumstances were to tip Prout that anything was coming. 10 days. The difficulty was that Colton had been watching Eudora more closely since the alley incident. She had noticed it, the way his eyes tracked her when she was on the street, the way he seemed to appear in her peripheral vision with a frequency that was not accidental. She had told Isaac about it, and he had told her to stay close to people and not to be out after dark alone. Advice she followed with the meticulous care of someone who understood what the alternative might be. On the 6th day of the 10, the situation became critical. Eudora was in the general store when she heard Colton tell Harlan Fitch, with the casual confidence of a man who did not care about being overheard, that he had sent a wire to a man he knew in Trinidad who was going to look into a woman named Eudora who might have come from Missouri, a woman whose brother had died in this valley over a year ago. He said it as if it were ordinary conversation about nothing particular, but Eudora, standing with her back to him in the lamp oil aisle, felt the information arrive like a cold hand on the back of her neck. He was going to find out who she was. The wire would get to Trinidad. Someone there would ask around. Her name was known in Trinidad because she had spent 2 months there before she came here, speaking to drifters and reading newspapers, and she had not been careful enough about her name because she had not imagined the connection would be made in the opposite direction. She bought her lamp oil and she walked to the livery with the unhurried step of a woman who had nothing particular on her mind, and she told Isaac what she had heard, and she watched his face go through a very controlled version of alarm. "How long until the wire gets an answer?" he said. 2 days, she said. "Maybe 3 if the man in Trinidad is slow. The marshal will not be here for 4 more days." They looked at each other. "We cannot wait," she said. "We cannot confront Prout without the marshal," he said. "We have no legal authority and he has 4 armed men in this town. Then we get the information somewhere safe before Colton figures out who I am," she said. We ride to meet the marshal. We go tonight. Isaac was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was running calculations, not the mathematical kind but the human kind, the kind that assessed risk and probability and the specific weight of what was at stake. That will tell Prout that something is wrong, he said. Colton is already suspicious, she said. If I disappear overnight and come back with a marshal, Prout might run. But if I stay and Colton identifies me, we lose everything because Prout will destroy the evidence before the marshal arrives. The letter is already sent, Isaac said. The original is in the marshal's hands. But we are the witnesses, she said. We are the corroboration. We are what makes the letter usable. The logic was unambiguous. We ride at midnight, he said. They left Perdition Creek at midnight with 2 horses and what they could carry without it being conspicuous to anyone watching. Eudora left a note for Clara that said simply she had been called away on family business and would return soon, which was not precisely a lie. They rode east along the Cimarron, away from town, and the night was enormous and clear above them and very cold, the kind of cold that sharpens everything at the edges, and the horses moved through it with their breath making white clouds in the dark. They rode through the night and into the early morning, and the landscape around them shifted from the valley floor to the wider plains, with the sky turning from black to a deep bruised blue at the edges. By sunrise they had covered 20 miles and they stopped to rest the horses beside a creek tributary, and Eudora wrapped herself in her blanket and leaned against her saddle, and Isaac sat across from her with his coffee cup and the small fire he had built with the quick competence of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He said, "Are you all right?" she said. "I am cold and I am tired and I am more frightened than I have been since I arrived, but yes." "The frightened part is appropriate," he said. "The rest will pass." She looked at him over the fire. In the early light he looked younger somehow, or perhaps he looked more like the person he actually was rather than the version of himself he maintained for public consumption. He looked like a man who had spent years being harder than he needed to be and who was, possibly, beginning to reconsider the cost of it. She said, "When this is over, what do you do?" He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I do not know," he said. "I have not thought past it. You have been in Perdition Creek for 5 years. I have. Is it where you want to be?" He looked at her for a long moment. "It was where I needed to be," he said. "Whether it is where I want to be is a question I have not had occasion to consider." She felt the question settle between them with its full implication, and she looked at the fire and she thought about Missouri, and she thought about a farm that no longer had Daniel in it, and she thought about what she had told herself she would do when this was over, which was to go home and grieve properly and rebuild something. She had not thought about what rebuilding might mean, specifically. She had not thought about it in terms of places and people. She was thinking about it now, and the thinking was dangerous because it was pulling in a direction she had not mapped. They reached the marshal's party on the afternoon of the 2nd day of riding. They had come further west than expected, a fast-moving group of 5 riders with the territorial seal on their riding coats, and the encounter happened on the open road with a directness that Eudora found almost relieving after weeks of careful obliqueness. Marshal Calhoun was a lean, silver-haired man from Albuquerque, who received them with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for 20 years, and had the specific intelligence to recognize immediately that the situation in Perdition Creek was more volatile than his correspondence had suggested. He listened to both of them with equal attention, which Eudora noted with a kind of hard gratitude. He asked precise questions, and he accepted their answers, and he looked at the original of Prout's letter that Isaac had taken out from the oilcloth wrap in his saddlebag, and read it twice and folded it and put it in his coat. "We go back tonight," he said. "All of us. If Prout suspects something, we need to arrive before he can run or destroy anything." "What about Colton?" Eudora asked. "Colton is secondary," the marshal said. "Prout is the key. With Prout in custody, Colton has nothing." "Colton killed my brother," Eudora said. The marshal looked at her with the careful expression of someone who was measuring grief against evidence. "We do not have direct evidence of that yet," he said, "but Prout will talk when he understands what we have. Men like Prout always give up men like Colton." She accepted this because she had to, because the truth was that the justice she wanted was also the justice the law could deliver, and she had chosen to work through the law rather than against it, and that choice had consequences that included accepting its pace and its processes. They rode back to Perdition Creek through the night, the combined party of 7 people moving fast and quiet in the cold dark, and the Cimarron Valley came up on them in the early morning with the town still sleeping in the blue pre-dawn light. It did not stay sleeping long. What happened in the next 2 hours in Perdition Creek on that November morning was loud and fast and frightening in specific places, and ultimately definitive. Marshal Calhoun moved with the authority of someone who had done this many times, and his deputies were efficient and calm, and Prout was found at his house still in his nightshirt, with the disoriented expression of a man whose carefully constructed world was dissolving around him faster than he could process, and was in irons within 15 minutes. Colton, it emerged, had been sleeping at the Copper Spur, and the response when the deputies came for him was not as quiet. There was a brief, ugly period of about 5 minutes involving shouting and one broken chair, and a pistol that was not ultimately fired. And at the end of it, Colton was also in irons, and the bar of the Copper Spur had 2 new dents in the wood of the counter. Eudora had stood in the main street during all of this with her hands clasped in front of her and her face very still, and when it was over and the dust of it had settled, and the growing crowd of Perdition Creek residents had gathered in their doorways and on their porches to watch the extraordinary spectacle of their sheriff being led away in chains by territorial marshals, she felt something she had been carrying for 14 months begin to lift. It was not relief, exactly. Relief implies an uncomplicated lightness, and this was not uncomplicated. Daniel was still dead. Edmundo Torres was still dead. 2 men in irons were not an ending. They were a beginning of another process that would take months in territorial courts and would require her testimony and Isaac's testimony, and the unraveling of an operation that had affected more people than she had been fully aware of when she started this. But the weight of it was different now. It was shared. It was moving through the mechanisms that were supposed to handle it rather than sitting in her chest like something unresolvable. Isaac came to stand beside her as the marshals took their prisoners toward the east road. He said nothing. He stood close enough that his arm was almost against hers, and she felt the warmth of him on her left side, and she did not move away. She said, "It is done." "It is started," he said. "It will not be done for a while yet." "I know," a pause. "Your brother," he said. "He would have been glad." She nodded. She did not trust her voice. Clara Enfield came bustling out of the boarding house with a shawl thrown over her night things and an expression of combined alarm and deep fascination, and she reached Eudora first and took both of her hands and looked at her with the bright, knowing eyes of a woman who had perhaps understood more of what was happening in her own boarding house over the past 6 weeks than Eudora had given her credit for. "Are you safe?" Clara asked. "Yes," Eudora said. "Good," Clara said firmly. And then she looked at Isaac with an expression that was not quite accusatory but carried the specific weight of a woman who has been worried about someone for a very long time, and she said, "I hope you have been looking after her." Isaac said, with complete seriousness, "She has been looking after herself." Clara made a sound that acknowledged this as accurate and went to organize breakfast for the marshals, because Clara's response to every form of crisis was to provide food, and it was one of the things Eudora loved about her. The word moved through her with a quiet shock. Loved. She had not used it consciously, but her mind had used it without asking her permission, and she stood in the main street of Perdition Creek on a cold November morning and held it there and looked at it. The days that followed were busy in ways that left little room for anything except the practical management of what had happened. The marshal required statements. The cattle buyers in Colorado were contacted. The full scope of the operation, which was larger than either Eudora or Isaac had known, began to come clear as Prout presented with the evidence and the prospect of what he faced, talked with the specific thoroughness of a frightened man. 2 of the Colorado buyers were arrested. 3 other ranches in the valley were implicated. The Mexican families who had been driven off their land were identified, and conversations were begun about restitution that would be slow and imperfect, but would be begun. Edmundo Torres' family was found living in Taos. The news of what had happened to him and why it had happened reached them through the marshal's office, and the acknowledgement that he had died not in a robbery but in deliberate violence to protect a criminal enterprise was, Eudora was told by one of the deputies, both devastating and vindicating for them. Colton was charged in connection with Daniel's death, not as neatly as Eudora had wanted, but with enough to ensure he would face justice for it. Prout testified about the specifics of what Colton had done in exchange for reduced charges on the lesser counts, and the territory's case was solid enough that the outcome, when it eventually came, would not require Eudora to be uncertain about it. She stayed in Perdition Creek through November and into December while the legal machinery moved. She did not intend to be there as long as it extended, but she found herself not particularly impatient to leave, and she spent a considerable amount of time examining her reasons for this without quite bringing herself to name the largest one directly. She and Isaac continued to meet at the river in the evenings. The meetings were different from before, simpler and in some ways more intense. There was no strategy between them anymore. There was no hidden motive on either side. There was only 2 people who had been thrown together by difficult circumstances and had found in each other something that was persisting past the circumstances. He told her about the years in Texas more fully. He told her about a brother named Caleb who had died of a fever when Isaac was 15, and who had been, from the way Isaac spoke of him, the better-natured of the 2 of them, and the person whose absence had left a shape in Isaac's life that nothing had quite filled. She told him about Daniel in the same way, not the grief story she had been carrying but Daniel himself, the person, who he had been, which was a young man with her father's stubbornness and her mother's gentleness, and a way of laughing at his own bad luck that had made everything easier. She told him about the farm. She told him about Missouri in the summer, which she described with a detail and warmth that surprised her, because she had not realized until she was describing it to someone else how much she had been longing for it. The wide, green flatness of it. The way the corn came up in rows so straight they looked intentional in a way that the desert was never intentional. The smell of rain on warm earth. He listened to all of it with his full attention. This man who had not wanted company for years, who had sat by rivers alone and made that solitude into something close to a choice, and the listening was itself a form of something. She recognized it because she had lived long enough and paid enough attention to know that listening is not passive, that a man who truly listens to you is giving you something that many people spend entire lives not receiving. On a Thursday evening in the second week of December, with a cold, clear sky above them, and the river moving low and iron-dark beneath them, he said it. He said, quietly and without preamble, as if he had been deciding whether to say it for some time and had simply come to the point in his calculation where saying it was the only sensible next step. I have sat here for years and never once wanted company until now. She turned to look at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the river in his way, the focused, private way that meant he was saying something he had not expected to say and was not entirely sure what would happen next because of it. "I know," she said. He looked at her then. "That is not entirely what I meant," he said. "I know that too," she said. She watched him take that in, watched the careful reserve of him process the fact that she understood what he was saying and was not frightened by it and was not leaving, and she watched something very old and very defended in his face begin slowly to let go. "I have not been good at this," he said. "Whatever this is, I have not practiced it. I do not know the steps of it." "Neither do I," she said. I came here with a plan that had nothing to do with this, and I have been undone by it for weeks, and I have been pretending otherwise, and I am very tired of pretending." "What are you not pretending?" he asked. She said, "That I do not want to leave." The river moved between the banks in the cold December evening, and the stars came out above the cottonwoods, and Isaac Yates reached out and took Eudora Graves's hand, which was a small gesture and an enormous one simultaneously, and she felt the warmth of it move all the way through her. "Then do not leave," he said. "It is not quite that simple," she said. "I know," he said. "Can be the thing we start from." She held his hand and she looked at the river and she thought about all of the things that needed to still be done, the testimony that needed to be given, the farm in Missouri and her mother who was still there, the grief for Daniel that needed more time than 6 weeks to fully walk through, the question of what life looked like when you had done the thing you came to do and found something else waiting on the other side of it. "I have to go back to Missouri," she said. "My mother. She does not know the full truth of what happened to Daniel yet. I need to bring it to her. I need to be there." "Yes," he said. He did not argue with it. "And then," she said carefully. "And then," he said in the tone of someone who is placing a question mark at the end of a sentence with some deliberateness. "And then I would like to come back," she said. She felt his hand tighten around hers. "I will be here," he said. She looked at him with the full weight of her, all of Eudora Graves, the farmer's daughter and the dead man's sister, and the woman who had ridden into a dangerous place alone, because it was the right thing to do. And she saw him looking back at her with the full weight of himself. This complicated, careful, deeply human man who had been sitting alone by the water for years, and had finally, by some collision of grief and necessity, and the plain, unpredictable force of two people becoming real to each other, decided that company was something he wanted. She said, "Isaac." "Yes," he said. She leaned toward him and kissed him, briefly and with great intention, and he held still for one surprised second, and then his free hand came up and cupped her face with a tenderness that was absolutely not the gesture of a man called the Cimarron Ghost, and she felt him breathe out against her as if he had been holding something in for a very long time. When she pulled back, he looked at her with those dark, precise eyes, and he said, "I did not calculate for this." "I know," she said, and she felt the smile on her face as if it were something new. "Neither did I." She left Perdition Creek on a December morning with the frost still on the ground, and the horse's breath making clouds in the cold air. Marshal Calhoun had arranged for her to give her formal statement in Trinidad on her way through, which she did in the orderly, detailed way that 2 months of preparation and 6 weeks of observation had made possible. The deputy marshal taking her statement looked at her with a mixture of professional respect and what she recognized as the particular discomfort of a man not quite accustomed to a woman who gave evidence with the precision and composure that this one did. She carried Isaac's handshake at the livery in the morning, and the way he had said "have a safe ride," and the way his hand had held hers for a second beyond the ordinary duration of a farewell. And she carried it through the stages and the cold miles, as if it were a letter from somewhere she was planning to return to. The train from Trinidad to Kansas City, and then to St. Louis, and then the long carriage ride home to the Missouri farm took 2 weeks and passed in the particular suspension of travel, the in-between state where you are neither where you were nor where you are going, and the world through the windows is a blur of plains and small towns and winter sky. Her mother, Ruth Graves, was waiting on the porch when Eudora came up the road in the hired wagon. She was a small, steady woman of 52 with Eudora's eyes and Daniel's stubbornness, and she held her daughter for a long time without speaking, and Eudora let herself be held for the first time in months and felt the specific safety of it, the particular grief of coming home to someone who loved you when the reason you were coming home was sorrow. She told her mother the truth, all of it, the whole shape of it, from the letter to Trinidad to Perdition Creek to the marshals. Ruth Graves listened with her hands folded in her lap and her face very still, and when Eudora was done she sat quietly for a long time, and then she said, "He was trying to get word out. He was trying to do the right thing." Yes, Eudora said. Like his father, Ruth said. It was not a question. They sat with that. Her mother asked about the rest of it, about Perdition Creek, about who had helped her. And Eudora told her about Isaac with the careful understatement of someone who has feelings too large and too new to fully display. And she watched her mother's face move through recognition and a careful, maternal assessment, and then something that was very close to gladness. He sounds like a man, Ruth said, in the specific tone that she had always used to distinguish men who were substantial from men who were not. He is, Eudora said. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Are you going back? Yes, Eudora said, and there it was said out loud in the Missouri farmhouse kitchen, definitive and real. Ruth nodded once. After Christmas, she said, you stay through Christmas, and then you go. Eudora stayed through Christmas. It was a quiet Christmas, the first one without Daniel, and its quiet was not emptiness exactly, but the particular texture of a family that has been reduced and is still figuring out its new shape. Eudora helped with the cooking and the mending and all the practical business of the farm, and she sat in the evenings by the fire and wrote a letter to Isaac that took her 4 drafts to get right, because she wanted to say what was true without overstating it, and without the distance of the letter making it sound less than what it was. She wrote, I find that I think of Perdition Creek more frequently than I think of anywhere I have ever left. I think mostly of the river in the evenings. I think about a man who told me something true and unexpected, and who I have been unable to stop considering ever since. I am coming back in January if you will still have me, not as Mrs. Calloway or as Daniel's sister or as a witness or any of the other things I have been here. As myself, as Eudora Graves, which is a simpler and a more frightening thing to be. She sealed it and sent it with the weekly post, and she did not hear back before she left in January, but she found, when she arrived back in Perdition Creek on a January afternoon with the sky enormous and blue above the valley, and the Cimarron running dark and cold between its banks, that Isaac Yates was at the livery stable where the stage stopped, waiting for her with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting long enough to make peace with the waiting itself. He helped her down from the stage step with his hand under her arm, and she looked at him in the winter afternoon light. This man she had come a very long distance to find for the wrong reasons and had stayed for the right ones, and she felt the full force of what it was to be standing in front of someone who knew exactly who you were. He said, you came back. I said I would, she said. People say a great many things, he said. I do not, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do before in a public space, or indeed in any space, which was to smile fully, without the reserve that usually contained it, and the transformation of his face under it was something she was quite certain she wanted to see for a very long time. No, he said, you do not. Clara Enfield appeared from the direction of the boarding house, with the beaming inevitability of someone who had been watching from her front window, and she embraced Eudora with the unself-conscious warmth of a person who has decided that warmth is the most appropriate response to almost every situation. And she looked between Eudora and Isaac with a satisfaction so transparent that Eudora found herself laughing, which was the first time she had laughed in what felt like a very long time. The winter passed with a slowness and a fullness simultaneously, the way time passes when you are paying attention to it properly. Eudora stayed at Clara's boarding house and found work keeping accounts for Harlan Fitch at the general store, which he had needed doing properly for years, and which she undertook with the efficient thoroughness that she brought to everything practical. The work was steady and quietly satisfying, and it gave her a place in the town that was hers, not borrowed from a cover story or derived from drama, but earned in the ordinary ongoing way. She and Isaac met at the river most evenings, and in other places too now, at the boarding house kitchen, where Clara fed them dinner with the cheerful regularity of someone facilitating something she approved of, at the general store, where Isaac occasionally had business, at the small adobe church on Sunday mornings, where the priest had returned from his 8-month absence and held services, that the town attended with the slightly sheepish renewed enthusiasm of people who had missed the ritual more than they admitted. The legal proceedings against Pruitt and Colton, and the Colorado buyers moved through the territorial courts with the measured pace of formal justice. Eudora was called to give her deposition in Santa Fe in February, and Isaac rode with her, and they spent 3 days in the territorial capital in the austere practicality of a pair of witnesses, and on the last evening before riding back to Perdition Creek. They walked through the Santa Fe Plaza in the cold blue evening, and Isaac bought her coffee from a vendor's cart, and they sat on a bench and looked at the governor's palace lit up against the winter sky. And it was so thoroughly ordinary and so entirely unremarkable that she felt the warmth of it in her chest, like something very specific to him, to the particular life that was assembling itself around her here. He said, "Eudora." She said, "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what specifically?" He took a breath in the way of a man who is about to say something that makes him vulnerable and has decided that this is acceptable. "About what you asked at the river. When you asked if Perdition Creek was where I wanted to be, I said I had not had occasion to consider it." "I remember," she said. "I have considered it now," he said. "And the answer is that I do not particularly care where I am in terms of geography. I care who I am there with." She held that. He looked at her with the full, deliberate directness that was entirely and specifically Isaac, and he said, "I would like to marry you, Eudora Graves, if that is something you could want." The Santa Fe evening moved around them, and the coffee steamed in her hands, and the lights of the palace lay gold on the plaza stones. And Eudora Graves, who had ridden into a dangerous valley alone with a dead man's letter sewn into her coat, and a plan that had nothing to do with love, looked at the man beside her who had been sitting alone at the edge of the world for 5 years waiting for something he did not have a name for, and she felt the absolute completeness of saying yes. She said yes. They were married in the little adobe church in Perdition Creek in March of 1882, on a bright cold Saturday with the Cimarron running high with snowmelt, and the cottonwood trees just beginning to show the first tentative green of their new leaves. The church was full. Eudora had not expected it to be full, but the town had apparently decided that this was something worth turning out for, and Clara Enfield sat in the front row with the expression of a woman who had always known this was going to happen and was gratified to have been right. And Carlos the freighter was there with his family, and Rosa Medina from the Copper Spur was there with her mother, and Harlan Fitch was there, and a great many people whose names Eudora had learned over the winter and who had become, in the slow accumulating way of small towns, the texture of her daily life. Ruth Graves had come from Missouri for the wedding, making the journey with the determined practicality of a woman who was not going to miss her daughter's wedding because of the inconvenience of distance. She sat beside Clara in the front row, and when the ceremony was done, she hugged Isaac Yates with a straightforwardness that made him look briefly startled and then quietly moved. And she told him in the low, private voice that Eudora just caught the edge of that. She was glad Eudora had found someone who knew what she was worth. And Isaac said, with great sincerity, that he was working on being adequate to that knowledge. Ruth went back to Missouri a week after the wedding, satisfied and slightly tearful in the private way she permitted herself in quiet moments, and she took with her a promise from Eudora that they would come in the summer, which they did, the two of them on the train in June, which was the first time Isaac had been east of the Cimarron Valley in several years, and which he approached with the equanimity he brought to most challenges, and the additional factor of clearly wanting to be good at meeting the remaining family of the woman he had married. He was good at it. Ruth Graves's remaining sons, Eudora's 2 older brothers James and Thomas, who had stayed on the farm, were initially the particular combination of skeptical and protective that men can be about their sisters' choices, and Isaac met this with the same patient, direct, unhurried quality he brought to most interactions. And by the end of the visit, Thomas had asked him 3 questions about cattle management that had been answered with unexpected depth, and James had asked him to look at a broken mechanism on the farm's hay press, and he had fixed it within an hour. And the skepticism had not disappeared exactly, but had softened into the acknowledgement that this was a real person and not a category. They came back to Perdition Creek in July of 1882 with the summer heat pressing down on the valley and the Cimarron low and amber between its banks, and Eudora was carrying their first child, though she did not know it yet with certainty. She figured it out on a Thursday morning in August with the particular knowledge that women develop about their own bodies, and she sat with the knowledge for 2 days in the way of someone who needs to get used to a truth before they share it. And then she told Isaac on a Friday evening at the river. He was quiet for a moment that she, knowing him as well as she now did, understood was not absence but the interior adjustment of someone receiving something large. Then he said, "A child." "Yes," she said. He looked at the river. Then he looked at her with an expression that was entirely unlike any she had catalogued in the early weeks of watching him, which was the expression of a man who has been given something he did not know he was allowed to have, and who is in the process of accepting that he is, in fact, allowed to have it. "I do not know anything about children," he said. "Neither do I, practically speaking," she said. "We will learn." "Together," he said. "Together," she confirmed. He reached out and took her hand in both of his, and held it with the care of someone holding something irreplaceable. And Eudora looked at this man by the river in the August evening, and felt the full shape of the life that had assembled itself on the other side of grief and recklessness, and a plan that had gone so beautifully wrong. Their son was born in March of 1883, 1 year to the month after their wedding, and they named him Daniel James Yates, which was a name that carried 2 losses and 1 continuity, and felt, when Eudora said it out loud for the first time, like a door between past and present held open rather than shut. Daniel James was, from the beginning, a spectacularly opinionated child with dark eyes like his father, and a stubborn disposition like both of his parents, and a laugh that was so completely his own that it felt like something invented specifically for him. He howled when he was hungry and went still and observant when he was content, and he had from the earliest age the quality of paying close attention to everything in his immediate environment that his father had, and that his mother had, and that in him looked like the beginning of something that would be remarkable. Isaac held his son with the focused care of a man who is very conscious of the weight of what he is holding, and he was not one of those men who found infants difficult. He had the patience for them. He had the stillness. He could sit with the baby for long stretches in the evening while Eudora slept, and he would look down at the small face with an expression that she glimpsed once when she woke unexpectedly, and that she never forgot for the rest of her life, because it was the expression of a man who has discovered that the solitude he chose was a waiting room, and that what he was waiting for was this. The Cimarron ghost, men had called him. The man who never wanted company. And here he was with a sleeping infant against his chest, and his wife in the next room, and a small house in a valley that had been through fire, and had come out the other side into something like peace, and the river moving outside as it had always moved, carrying the iron smell of distance and the weight of what the land had seen. They added a room to the house in the spring of 1884 in anticipation of the second child, which arrived in August of that year, a daughter they named Ruth Clara after both of the women who had bookended the story of how they got here, and who arrived with considerably more drama than her brother had, and immediately set about expressing strong opinions about everything in her environment with a vigor that made Eudora think of herself at 5 years old, and that made Isaac look at his daughter in the early weeks with an expression somewhere between awed and slightly resigned. "She is going to be a great deal of work," he said, on one of the first evenings with Ruth Clara sleeping between them on the bed, which was not where babies were supposed to sleep, but was where she had decisively made clear she intended to sleep. "Yes, Eudora said. "I mean that as a compliment," he said. Eudora laughed. Perdition Creek changed in the years that followed. The cattle theft ring had been dismantled and the trials had concluded, and the town, without Prute's particular gravitational pull on its darker elements, settled into something quieter and more ordinary. Some people left. New people came. A doctor arrived in 1884 who set up a proper practice. The church got a permanent priest. The copper spur changed hands, and the new owner, a man from Tennessee named Horace Webb, ran it with considerably more interest in serving decent food than in accommodating men with hard eyes and unspeakable business. Eudora's accounting work for Harlan Fitch expanded over the years to include 3 other businesses in town, and eventually encompassed a kind of informal bookkeeping service that she ran from a desk in the front room of their house during the hours when both children were at the small school that the town established in 1885. She had a head for numbers that Clara had always insisted was a gift, and that Isaac acknowledged with the affectionate respect of a man who genuinely enjoyed being competent adjacent to someone more competent than himself in a particular domain. Isaac's work shifted too. The cattle problems in the valley had reduced the demand for the specific kind of dangerous work he had been doing, and he found himself moving toward the management side of ranching, eventually taking on a role with a large ranch north of town whose owner, a Colorado man named Ashworth who had no interest in living on the land he had bought and every interest in someone trustworthy managing it at a distance, gave him both meaningful work and a salary that made the practical business of raising 2 children considerably less stressful. He was, it turned out, an exceptionally good ranch manager. The same qualities that had made him effective in more violent contexts, the patience, the precision, the ability to read situations before they became problems, the absolute reliability about doing what he said he was going to do, translated seamlessly into the management of land and animals and the people who worked them. The cowboys who worked under him were not afraid of him exactly, but they were careful in his presence and consistently respectful in his absence, which was a more durable form of professional authority than fear. Carlos and his family remained close through all of it. There was a particular friendship between Carlos and Isaac that had its roots in the specific shared experience of people who have been on the right side of a dangerous thing together. And it was the kind of friendship that does not need frequent maintenance because it is built on something structural rather than circumstantial. Carlos's children and Daniel James and Ruth Clara grew up knowing each other, and the injustice that had driven Carlos's cousin's family from their land was not undone, but was at least named and mourned in a community that understood it. In the late summer of 1886, a letter arrived from the territorial marshal's office informing Eudora that the final appeal in the Colton case had been denied and that the sentence was confirmed. She read the letter in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with Daniel James in the yard making noise about something and Ruth Clara on her hip, and she felt the news settle through her with the particular quality of things finally fully finished. She had a photograph of Daniel, one of the last taken before he went west, a stiff formal thing from a photographer in Kansas City where he had stopped on his way to New Mexico, and it sat on the mantelpiece in a small frame between a river stone she had picked up from the Cimarron bank on her first evening there, and a dried cottonwood leaf from the same evening, which she had pressed flat and kept without quite understanding why until she understood that it was a record of the place where her life had changed. She told Isaac about the letter that evening, and he was quiet with it for a moment, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. "I have been all right for a while now." "This just makes it fully true. Justice is slow," he said. "But it arrived," she said. He nodded. He had his daughter on his knee by this point, and she was attempting to braid the fringe on his shirt, and he was tolerating it with the patient forbearance of a man who had made his peace with the small domestic indignities of parenthood, and he looked up at Eudora over Ruth Clara's dark head, and the look between them carried everything that 4 years of shared life carry. All the arguments and the reconciliations and the exhausted nights and the beautiful ordinary mornings and the specific irreplaceable weight of being known by someone. "Come to the river tonight," he said. "After they are asleep," she smiled. Yes. They went after the children were settled, walking down through the October dark to the cottonwood bend of the Cimarron as they had done since the beginning of it, as they would do for the rest of their lives, the river the constant thread through everything, the place where the story had arrived at its truest point. The Cimarron moved under the stars in that slow brown way it had, carrying the smell of iron and clay and cold distance, and they sat on the flat rock that had been theirs for years now, and Eudora leaned into the warmth of Isaac's side, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the dark and the quiet and the moving water. "5 years ago," he said after a while, "I sat here alone and I thought I had arranged my life correctly." "Had you?" she asked. "I thought so," he said. "I thought correctness was the goal, remove the variables, reduce the exposure, maintain the distance." He paused. "I was wrong about the goal." "What is the goal?" she asked, though she knew. He turned and kissed the top of her head with the unhurried tenderness of someone who has been doing this for 4 years and intends to do it for 40 more. "This," he said. "Everything that this is." She had started here with a plan. She had ridden into a dangerous place with a hidden motive and a false name, and the fierce, frightened determination of a woman who had decided that if the law would not do it, she would do it herself. She had come to use a man and had found a person instead, had come looking for evidence and had found the truth, had arrived carrying grief like a weapon, and had discovered that grief, fully walked through, opens into something else. Her brother had been a young man with his father's stubbornness and her mother's gentleness, and he had gone west looking for something that felt like a future. He had found something dark instead, and he had tried to do the right thing, and it had cost him everything. But it had set something in motion that had not ended with him. It had reached forward through 14 months of grief and determination, and one woman's refusal to let it be nothing. And it had arrived here, at this river, at this man, at these 2 children asleep in the house behind them, at this life that had been built on the foundation of his courage and her persistence, and the unexpected intervention of a man who had been sitting alone at the edge of the world waiting for a reason to stop. She thought about him, her brother, and she said his name quietly into the river dark. "Daniel." The Cimarron moved. The stars wheeled in the enormous New Mexico sky. Isaac's arm was warm around her, and the river carried its old slow weight of distance and return, and somewhere in the house their children were sleeping the deep, unreachable sleep of children who are safe, who are loved, who do not know yet what the world can require of people, and who have 2 people prepared to stand between them and that knowledge for as long as standing is possible. The October cold came down from the high country, and the cottonwoods moved their golden leaves in the dark, and the night was the specific wild depth of the high desert night, immeasurable and full of stars, the kind of sky that had been over this land for thousands of years, and would be over it for thousands more, indifferent and magnificent and entirely present. 2 people sat by the water in it, as simple and as complex as any 2 people who have found their way to the same place from very different directions, and the river moved and the stars moved and the night held them, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.